We're now pleased to be able to take a break from our academic perspectives on the Clean Water Act and get a perspective from the folks that actually have to enforce and implement and administer it in the face of all the challenges that the Clean Water Act faces. And so I'd like to introduce Ms. Elizabeth Caesar, who is Special Assistant to the Administrator in the Office of Water, on loan from the Joyce Foundation, where she has overseen their environmental programs. And for those of us in the Great Lakes region, we know that water quality in the Great Lakes in particular is a particular concern of the Joyce Foundation and has been a particular concern of Ms. Caesar's throughout her work at EPA, at the Joyce Foundation, and before. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn the podium over to Ms. Caesar.
Good morning, everybody, and I will have to start by saying I'm excited to have our colleagues here from NEORSD. If EPA had a Twitter feed like yours, I really think we would be in a very different place. Highly recommend for people who care about water, the NEORSD Twitter feed. So as Jonathan said, I'm a senior policy advisor to Assistant Administrator Pfas, and I'm there on an interagency personnel agreement from the Joyce Foundation, and that's important because that means I'm not a political appointee. But also just want to remind everybody, with all of the current litigation and the rulemakings that are in front of the agency, there are going to be limitations to my comments that will probably frustrate everybody. And I'm going to really be focusing more on policy issues. Jonathan asked me to kind of talk about what are the opportunities and challenges we're facing at the agency right now, how are we approaching them, and the panel we just heard probably in a nutshell capsulizes many of the challenges we're facing sort of across the board, both on the regulatory and litigation front. I think one of the things I'll start with is, I don't know of a time in my career where I've seen the Office of Water tackling such a broad range of issues proactively, whether that's regulatory, permitting, or in the litigation context. As well as, frankly, managing what we hope to be is a transformational investment in water infrastructure through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And given the breadth of this work that was facing the administration, both the administrator and the assistant administrator really have had to identify some initial areas of focus. And I'm going to touch on a couple of those, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And again, I just want to say, because of all the litigations we're facing right now and the rulemakings that we're undertaking, there are going to be limits to the kinds of things I can address either in my remarks or in responses to your questions. And as I reflected on what I was going to talk about today, especially with the importance of the Clean Water Act at 50, I wanted to talk about a couple of cross-cutting priorities that you'll see reflected in the Office of Water's work. First, Administrator Regan and Assistant Administrator Fox take very seriously their responsibility to make sure that the protections of the law and the resources the federal government has at its disposal reach everyone. You'll see that reflected in the actions the agency took in 2021 and those that we're going to be taking this year and beyond. The agency is also increasing its enforcement activities under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which I'll speak more about in a minute. Second, science is back at EPA. The agency is looking hard at public health and environmental data, and policy decisions are being driven by what the data tells us. Now, as our colleague, Brother Adler, will tell us, there was a lot of room for healthy debate about what policy actions one might take based on the available data, but there's really a strong emphasis on restoring the scientific integrity of the work being done by EPA, but also making sure our career scientists feel comfortable talking transparently about their work and its implications. So let me give you some specific examples about how these values are playing out across our work. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure and Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act. So as many of you know, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law delivers more than $50 billion with a B to the EPA to improve our nation's drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure. This is the single largest investment in water that the federal government has ever made. More than $43 billion of that money will flow through the state's revolving drinking water and clean water funds. That means that the states will set policy largely on how that money flows. Nearly half of that money must be provided as grants and forgivable loans. Last month, EPA issued an implementation memo for those funds that will flow through the SRFs. And in that memo, one of our top priorities is ensuring that disadvantaged communities benefit equitably from this historic investment. These communities are found in rural, urban, and suburban parts of our country, in every state, in every territory, and on tribal lands. And they often include low-income people and communities of color. And as you know, disadvantaged communities really are on the front lines of our biggest environmental challenges, experiencing disproportionately high levels of exposure and pollution in air, land, and water. I will also add, because they are low income, that means that challenging troubles and difficulties in infrastructure have largely been left unresolved because states turn their back or can't find an answer because there are just not the resources to cover the cost. So one thing to keep in mind is both the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act gives states the ability to decide which communities qualify for additional support through their SRF programs by giving them the authority to define the term disadvantaged community on the drinking water side and to set the affordability criteria on the clean water side. And while states work to roll out these funds, EPA does expect them to evaluate and revise their affordability criteria and definitions of disadvantaged community to maximize the impact of these funds in addressing urgent water challenges that are facing communities. EPA also recognizes that many communities are going to require more assistance to access these funds. So we have been requesting and urging states to use the 2% technical assistance set aside to help disadvantaged communities complete their SRF funding requirements. The agency is also going to be rolling out a robust technical assistance strategy of its own to help support communities that face challenges in accessing these state revolving loan funds. So another way that the agency, particularly under Administrator Regan's leadership, is working to ensure that EPA is delivering legal protections and federal resources to every community is to bring EPA's enforcement of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act in line with the enforcement activities of our sister agencies in the federal government. As you know, Title VI prohibits recipients of federal funds, whether they're states, local governments, or private entities, from discriminating based on race, color, or national origin in any program or activity. Title VI prohibits not only actions that are intentionally discriminatory, but also actions that have an unjustified, disproportionate impact on the basis of race, color, or national origin. The threat of withholding federal funds afforded by a civil rights law has been a powerful tool for driving change to address discriminatory practices. But in the past, EPA really hasn't been fully engaged as other federal agencies in ensuring compliance with Title VI obligations. The agency's Title VI approach is really rooted in its history. When EPA was created in 1970, several years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, civil rights enforcement really took a backseat to other priorities. And the agencies really struggled to recognize that environmental statutes on their own don't address racial disparities in exposure to pollution, nor do they address disparities in the way people are treated based on their race, color, or national origin in environmental decision-making processes. In 2020, the EPA's Inspector General found that EPA is not providing the oversight needed to ensure that our organizations receiving EPA funding are complying with Title VI. The Biden administration and Administrator Regan are really committed to ensuring that EPA steps up to its obligations, and we're taking both internal and external actions to catch up with our sister federal agencies in this area. For example, in the Office of Water, you'll see that new guidances for states, including the implementation memo for the bipartisan infrastructure law that I just mentioned, explicitly references Title VI obligations, and you'll see that consistently in our program and funding documents going forward. I'd also note that EPA has accepted jurisdiction over a civil rights complaint filed on behalf of the residents of Providence, Rhode Island. The complaint alleges that Providence Water's water main replacement and rehabilitation program and its general policy and practice of private side lead service line replacements disproportionately increase the risk of lead exposure for Black, Latinx, and Native Americans. And if you all are not like fully versed in how lead service line replacement and are interested in this, I'm happy to get into that during Q&A. So while not prejudging, and because of this is an open investigation, this is really all I can say. The EPA will be looking at the following question: whether Providence Water Supply Board discriminates on the basis of race and national origin through its water main replacement and rehabilitation program, and whether its general policy and practice for private side, and through its general practice for private side lead service line replacements. I'd also note that many cities implement their lead service line replacements in the way that Providence Water has. Jonathan asked me about suggestions for research, and this might be an area that would be interesting to examine. Are there areas where EPA should be looking with particular care at Title VI compliance by recipients of federal funding from us? The third example I'd like to share kind of falls at the intersection of our interests in ensuring EPA's water work benefits everybody and the importance of the Clean Water Act enforcement as we approach the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And I'm afraid this is going to perk up the ears of my friends at NEORSD. It's about the financial capability assessment guidance. It's pretty wonky, but since I'm talking mostly to a group of lawyers, I feel pretty comfortable getting kind of wonky. So the financial capability assessment guidance currently out for public comment outlines a set of factors that EPA will consider when setting a schedule for a municipality to address Clean Water Act violations. It describes the information and the formulas that the agency intends to use to assess the financial resources that a community has available to implement control measures when municipal discharges cause violations of the Clean Water Act. This is particularly relevant. There are lots of Great Lakes cities that have consent orders with EPA that are coming up for review. So this is an area where we know there will be a lot of attention. The proposed guidance tackles head-on the challenges of protecting clean water in every community in America while aiming to ensure that water services remain affordable to all. So for the first time, EPA will be asking municipalities seeking schedule extensions and certain water quality standard revisions to affirmatively demonstrate the actions they've taken to help ensure that low-income customers can afford water services. It isn't sufficient to just present data that a system has a significant number of low-income customers. The agency will be asking what affirmative steps the system has taken to assist those customers, particularly at this time where there's so much money moving through the SRFs that is available for as either grants or 100% forgivable loans. There's never been a better opportunity for communities to take advantage of these resources, particularly to protect their lowest income customers. This more detailed analysis will help communities and EPA get a clearer picture of a community's financial capability and strategies we can use to protect low-income residents and achieve timely and equitable clean water protections. Together with the bipartisan infrastructure law, this guidance will support lower-income residents having more rigorous Clean Water Act protections. And the guidance is also an example about how the administration and the Office of Water are really looking carefully across policies to try to ensure that the agency is meeting the end goal of environmental protections for everybody, no matter their income or zip code. The other cost-cutting priority I want to talk about briefly is, as we reflect on the agency's opportunities and challenges at the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, we really are emphasizing this sense that science is back and that scientists feel comfortable raising to political leadership. Here are the implications of the data that we're seeing, regardless of whether that's a comfortable analysis or not. And one place you're going to see that is the agency's work to address Pfas contamination. Our Pfas strategic roadmap, released in October, outlines a whole-of-agency approach that will be taken to Pfas. And a key commitment to that, in that roadmap, is to propose a drinking water regulation for PFOA and PFOS, and potentially other PFAS by the fall of 2022, and to promulgate a final regulation by the fall of 2023. We're currently conducting the economic analysis and consultations required to propose a drinking water regulation, including seeking input from our state co-regulating partners. The second example of this administration's commitment to following the science is the lead and copper rule. The science of lead is settled, there's no safe level of exposure to lead. In December, EPA announced that the agency is working to strengthen the lead and copper rule to be more protective of public health. The agency concluded our review of the lead and copper rule revisions and have identified more opportunities to to be proactive and embed equity in this work. We reached these conclusions following a really robust public engagement process between April and August of last year, where we actually sat down with 10 communities that had direct experience with lead exposure in their water, roundtables that included residents with agendas set by those residents. And the regulatory staff that worked on the rule were actually the people who led and helped facilitate those meetings. And that one-on-one interaction, I think, really helped inform in a different way, based on lived experience, how the regulation was working and not working for communities. So the lead and copper and rule revisions that were drafted under the prior administration have gone into effect to really help support near-term actions that will reduce lead in drinking water while we work on the next rule. One of the most significant of these is the completion of lead service line inventories, and at the same time, as I said, we're embarking on another rule to further strengthen the protections that this rule can offer. We're in the active process of developing the rule and remain committed to following the science and the law. And we're on track to have that final rule before the end of the first Biden administration. The work on the lead and copper rule is just part of a holistic approach at EPA that we're taking to address lead. And so I'm going to just stop there. I think the thing I really wanted to focus on here is we're really trying to look holistically at both high-profile things, guidances and implementations and funding documents that are very down far in the interstices of the agency, to identify places where we can institutionalize and make more durable allegiance to science, the capacity of career staff to identify and document issues, so that as we move forward, we can try to address some of the ping-ponging we've seen in recent years. You know, we'll see if that's something we're able to accomplish, but that is very much something the administrator cares deeply about. So I'm going to stop there, talk long enough, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. I'm Eric Luckage. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at the Sewer District, actually. So we really appreciate hearing what you have to say. And it's a lot of the continuing dialogue that we've been having with the agency, certainly. And I appreciated hearing the holistic approach to things. We hope that from the overall regulatory standpoint that there's a holistic approach to that as well. And what I mean by that is that when we're talking about money, and we're talking about $43 billion for the country, our district has a $3 billion consent decree for combined sewer overflows just for our community. And so we appreciate $43 billion, and we look forward to more.
Yep, 100% in agreement with that. Let's talk about it.
And certainly more grants than loans, because our community is paying back those loans, and we appreciate them as well. They're very helpful because of the low interest. So we at the district are also very laser focused on environmental justice issues. It's a very big aspect of our community. And so when we're looking at trying to solve those problems and trying to focus on environmental justice communities and all of that, we're also sort of staring straight ahead at PFAS, right? And what's coming down the road. And what are those regulations going to look like, and what are the costs going to be associated with those? We're also hearing quite a bit of discussions about nutrients and phosphorus and lowering those limits to really low levels. And what's the cost going to be on that? So as we look at all of these problems holistically, we like to talk about, integrated planning with respect to how is a community like ours going to address all these very important issues and address the environmental justice aspect of it and pay for it. And we take a lot of heat for our rates already. And we want nothing more than to clean up more of the problems and do even more. But there's a real balance to be found there. So I would just like to emphasize the importance of the ongoing funding and the ongoing understanding of how all these pieces fitting together, particularly on the PFAS and the phosphorus issues, are coming together at the same time and to be gentle with us. I'm
No,
begging.
I couldn't agree more. And it's a tough balancing act, right? Like, which is your favorite child? Or your least favorite child, maybe. I think if the EPA issued a nutrient policy memo this week, and one of the things we talk about is NPS program permitting. And we're going to be doing some rulemaking and some guidance to make it clear to states that integrated planning, watershed-based permitting, these are all appropriate approaches for permitting, because these upstream, downstream challenges, especially around phosphorus, especially in this part of the country, it is way cheaper to deal with that stuff outside of the fence line. And really trying to make it clear without creating some crazy market of credits that isn't going to work. To be able to make sure facilities like yours have the ability to write into their permits upstream and downstream controls. So I hear you, and I think that's one of the things that's really tricky right now, is that a lot of the regional staff that have the capacity to help states and utilities work through some of these complex questions about, like, where are we going to focus? We've got limited dollars, we've got a host of issues. A lot of those folks have retired. And the challenge that we have as an agency of rebuilding our capacity is a really significant one.
Thank you for that, and thanks for the shout out on the Twitter. Rick's actually building really cool tunnels that are probably even better than the Twitter
I
account.
mean, as good as Wisconsin's tunnels or Chicago's? I don't know,
They're
don't
way
talk
better.
about that. Smart sewers in Mayor Petestown are also pretty cool.
We have 7 of them, though.
To build on that, 43 billion, 50 billion sounds like a lot of money, a huge investment, but as you just demonstrated, it's nowhere near enough to deal with all the problems across the United States. Are you able to go beyond the specific loans and guarantee, say, if they're issuing a bond to use, or can you allow the SRF to use the funds to guarantee that, which would greatly expand the reach of the funding?
So states have that authority now, and many of them use it now, use it very well, very creatively. We don't have the authority to make them do it. And so, but I think one of the things that can be done is really highlighting the value and the way that those kinds of approaches stretch that money. But what we're also seeing is a lot of states have a whole bunch of money in the bank that they haven't gotten in the ground. And that's where we're really trying to lean in, because one of the problems is the pipeline of projects to the communities that need it most. Those communities don't have the capacity to develop the infrastructure plan, to get the resources, and then put it in the ground. And that's a place where we're really trying to lean in. Go ahead.
Sorry,
Thanks. I may be wrong about this because it's not my particular field. I thought the problem with using the Civil Rights Act for environmental justice was you needed to show intent.
No, not under Title VI.
So the intent is only Title VII.
Yeah, this is an unjustified disproportionate impact. So in the case, what's alleged in the case in Providence is that when you replace a lead service line, if you replace only half of it, the quote-unquote public side,
yeah.
a partial, you actually increase the risk of exposure. And so if the way the program is laid out is you only replace the full line if the resident can pay for it, the impact is that if people who can't pay are now exposed to more lead. And so, this analysis has 2 parts. There has to be a disproportionate impact that's unjustified. And so this is the question that we will be looking at.
Please join me in thanking Ms. Cesar for